This video is sponsored by Squarespace. When we look at the average tropes of various character types, our perceptions are largely based upon a historical blueprint which is then layered on top with various other attributes. These attributes come and go with the passage of time and correlate directly or indirectly with each generation's impression of certain portrayals in the media we consume. For example, if you were born around the 80s and 90s, when you hear the term queer-coded villain, you may often think of the self-assured, flamboyant, standalone characters who don't conform to the typical views or standards set out by the narrative, which often in turn is a reflection of society at large. In contrast, older generations may have a more rigid view of queer-coded villains being unredeemable, predatory, and sadistic, and younger generations may swing in the complete opposite direction and see them as troubled souls who undergo a type of character redemption as they shift away from antagonistic and more towards a form of anti-hero. Historically, queer narratives were relegated to discussions or allegories that did their best to not acknowledge the true nature of their depictions, or if they did, it was to be depicted in a way that didn't inspire sympathy from the audience. Despite that though, there was always a sense of intrigue that emanated from these characters that held the general public's interest enough for them to be a mainstay even when under scrutiny. They were perhaps a cautionary tale, if you will, that eventually compelled the greater discussion surrounding them to be turned on its head as new societal norms were founded. Nowadays, queer-coded villains, or perhaps in recent times just queer villains, despite being a prevalent trope for many years now, has grown and changed considerably alongside the ever-shifting socio-political views concerning the queer identity. And today, I would like to invite you all to take a look at a few instances of these portrayals and how this was achieved. Hello everyone, this is fionapollo and I discuss various media-centric topics regarding character tropes, fandom behaviour, and other such pop culture prevalences. I'll be looking at several cases of queer-coded villains throughout media's history, from the monsters of past gothic fiction right up to modern perceptions, in order to paint a picture of how this trope has evolved and adapted to new viewership and societal standards. I am an animator, therefore most of my examples will be relegated to animated media. However, this also does tend to be where these types of characters thrive, as animation allows for their personalities to be exceptionally exaggerated, which is pretty in line with how wider society seems to believe queer people behave anyway, wouldn't you agree? Please note that much of what I discuss in my videos is purely speculative and is not based in fact unless evidence is given to state the contrary. And of course, if you enjoy my discussion today, then please consider liking and subscribing, and if you have any of your own points or examples that you would like to put forth, please feel free to do so in the comments. Feedback is always appreciated here. Now, I have quite a few campy villains that I would like to talk about, so let's get to it. Before we delve into our topic properly, I'd like to first draw your attention to this video's sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is a handy-dandy little website builder that allows you to create professional, eye-catching websites for every one of your possible needs. Whether you're a freelancer who requires a portfolio, are running a small business, or maybe a secret third thing, I don't know what you're into. Whether you're new to the scene of your choosing or have been at it for a while, one of the greatest assets to having things together is an efficient and intuitive base of operations for yourself and those you wish to engage. For instance, I want to focus a lot more this year on developing and producing my short series, Mint and Friends, but a lot of people have been asking me if there was a place that housed all of the information regarding the plot, characters, and any artwork or currently released videos or other content containing it. And despite it being on my to-do list for longer than I care to admit, Squarespace has allowed me to finally pin that down and provide fans and interested persons with a place to peruse this wonderfully silly world of my own creation. Creating the website is exceptionally easy and shouldn't give anyone too much trouble, with design intelligence from the site's industry-leading expertise making it simpler than ever to find and select a website design that caters to everything you need right then and there. And you even get a free trial to create a bespoke and tailor-made little slice of the internet that screams you to see how you like everything first before making that commitment. I'm also not really someone who sells art that I've already created, however, I am someone who does commissions from time to time, and I know multiple people who do in fact sell their own physical items, and Squarespace's impressive e-commerce integrations make it super quick and easy to link up to any online shops or purchasing portals for those who make merch, prints, or any on-demand products. You can also use the site to create invoices to collect payments simply and efficiently so that you can focus on the things that matter to your business. Want to allow potential clients to submit email inquiries? Simple. Want to give them the tools to buy products quickly and easily without navigating to a million different places? Done and dusted. So no matter what kind of website your heart desires, be sure to check out squarespace.com for a free trial. And once you're all set up and ready to go to squarespace.com/fionapollo to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Good luck! Now, where were we? Sweetheart, there is an entire couch right next to you, and you choose to sit on a piece of sound foam on the floor. If we want to look at the more historical depictions of queerness portrayed as villainy, we need to go back in time and delve into the first recognisable semblances, symbolic, contextual or otherwise, that point towards the manifestation of queerness being associated with sin. And in order to do that, we first need to pinpoint some of the earliest instances of potentially queer characters present within fiction before this particular association with villainy became widespread, because by doing so, we will be able to follow along with the progression of how several iterations and stereotypes formed and influenced each other to become the tropes that we recognise in our current media. Now, before movies and TV and screens, of course, we had literature and plays, and for as long as people have been able to read and write, these have been the most straightforward avenues that allowed people from all walks of life to put forth their own musings, confoundments, stories, and retellings of the human condition, in whatever form it took. And perhaps one of the earliest instances of this being the case can be found within the Iliad, one of the famous Greek poems recounted by the great bard Homer, also known as one of the oldest pieces of literature that still retains a high percentage of modern relevance in fiction. Throughout modern history, the Iliad has undergone multiple interpretations of its original text, with one of the most famously and controversially revised aspects being the nature of the relationship between two heroes of the Trojan War, Achilles and Patroclus. In the Iliad, Achilles and Patroclus are described as companions in war. However, Achilles, after being slighted by Agamemnon, refuses to fight anymore, leaving Patroclus to take up the mantle wearing his companion's armour, after openly weeping to Achilles in an attempt to change his mind when the tide of war had turned to favour the Trojans. Patroclus is subsequently slain, leaving Achilles to finally abandon his restraint and slaughter many Trojans, in turn out of despair and mourning. It's said that Achilles refused to exhume the body until Patroclus' own ghost came to ask him to do so in order to pass on to the underworld, and after Achilles himself was killed, both men's ashes were said to have been buried together in a golden urn. Now, you may all be thinking to yourselves, these are two Greek heroes, not villains, so what does this actually have to do with the discussion at hand regarding queer villains in particular? Well, the reason I bring this up is that it provides us with one of the earliest instances of a trope we all know too well at this point, the bury your gays trope. There is of course some contention as to whether this actually counts, as they die in battle rather than dying purely because they are perceived to be two men in love, but the act of dying in itself has come to be a historical point of retribution in fiction both for queer characters and villain characters respectively, due to how disproportionately they are subjected to it compared to their narrative counterparts, which is why I felt this was relevant. Despite that though, there are several instances of modern adaptations choosing to alter or even rectify the portrayals of the relationship in a less ambiguous manner as a way to circumvent or soften the typically bittersweet end that these characters often experience. And this is all too likely due to that aforementioned affiliation. Multiple interpretations have been created that sprouted from the original Iliad tale, for example, and this is accompanied with various other corroborating factors that can back up the reasonings behind such aspects of these characters taking precedence depending on how you choose to look at them. For one thing, as we all know, these are two men from ancient Greece, which was famously lenient in terms of relationships that involved two men. Women were a bit of a different story, however, we do have some instances of this being portrayed as well, such as in the case of the great poet Sappho. But just looking at men for the moment, several Greek gods, including Apollo and even Zeus himself, also took one or more male lovers, so it wasn't out of the realm of possibility for people to perceive the tragic and interwoven fate of Achilles and Patroclus as anything less than romantic, one such prevalent instance being The Song of Achilles, a book written by Madeline Miller in 2011, which is a retelling of the Trojan War as told from the perspective of Patroclus. This perspective allows Madeline to interpret the pair's relationship in a more objective light, and she isn't the only one to do this either. In the 2020 video game Hades, Achilles is a mentor to the underworld prince Zagreus within the main house, whose objective is to escape the underworld, and during his various escape attempts to reach the surface, you have the chance to encounter Patroclus within Elysium, which triggers a side quest to bring Achilles and Patroclus back once more as lovers even after death. However, despite more modern endeavours to reinterpret or accompany canon throughout literature, a surefire way to communicate a sense of comeuppance to any perceived slight towards the societal norm was the offending party's death. If a character was to die, it was because they were morally corrupt and in need of ultimate correction of which they could not return. And to assert this fact, ironically enough, we're going to jump forward to 1872 with one of the earliest known works of vampiric fiction, Carmilla. Carmilla is a gothic novella written by Irish author Sheridan Le Fanu, which recounts the tale of the young protagonist Laura, who claims to have a vision of being visited by a very beautiful visitor in her bedchamber when she was 6, as well as receiving a puncture wound on her chest, though no evidence of this is present when she awakes. Following this, a carriage accident results in a mysterious and recognizable girl of Laura's age living with her family who goes by the name of Carmilla. It's noted in the novella that Carmilla will sometimes make romantic advances at Laura, but won't engage in prayer, sleeps during the day, and is active during the night, signaling to the audience that this is a reclusive character of ill repute, and serves to entangle this with Carmilla's decidedly anti-heteronormative leanings. Thus, we have an early instance of a queer-coded villain character. After falling ill and having nightmares of a beast feeding from her during her sleep, Laura and her father seek answers and discover that Carmilla is a vampire who had previously attacked another young girl, Bertha, who had also become romantically taken with Carmilla before her death. The novella ends with Carmilla being slain by being staked through the heart and her head severed by the descendant of a vampire hunter, Baron Vordenberg. The story of Carmilla predates that of the more famous vampire Dracula by 25 years. However, Carmilla's influence could still be felt within the perverse undertones of which Dracula drew upon, and before long, vampires, werewolves, and gothic monster fiction in general became synonymous with forbidden romances and sexual perversion, of which were very often considered the hallmarks of homosexuality back in the day. Was that always the case? Definitely not. And there were likely a multitude of books and other types of fiction that allowed for more considerably modern sentiments towards queer people. However, one of the big deciders of morality back then, when it came to Western standards, was, of course, religion, with Christianity being the most dominant. Surprise, surprise. It's honestly no surprise that when we look at monster fiction, creatures that shun the word of God exhibit the same behaviours that we may draw comparisons to when we think of estranged family members who weren't quite the same as everyone else. They had different habits, different fixations, they weren't community-oriented enough apparently, and their influence was thought to result in the corruption of those susceptible to their whims, namely younger people or those who ask too many questions rather than accepting things the way they are. I also personally see monster fiction regarding vampires and werewolves to be two sides of the same coin regarding the queer experience when you consider all the different ways they can be interpreted, mostly in the sense of how both relate to how these outcasts interact with their former communities. It genuinely does not surprise me that so many queer people find kinship with these creatures because, to me at least, the parallels to being spoken about as cold, calculating, living in seclusion, and quite literally sucking the life out of people instead of conforming to what is expected of you in the case of the vampire, and the more volatile, quote, uncontrollable outbursts that come after trying to appear normal for so long, only for other people to shun you and reassert that you can't defeat your animalistic tendencies in the case of the werewolf, really does feel almost uncanny. Actually, thinking about it now, and after having read It Came From the Closet by Joe Vallès, it seems that coming to terms with other people's lifestyles is a fairly terrifying endeavour when you contribute to the majority of society, from interacting with a trans person all the way down to your daughter graduating from girlhood to womanhood, apparently. Horror and queerness go hand in hand by virtue of how a lot of horror tends to lend itself to the prospect of an intrinsic fear of the familiar yet unknown. Once the unknown has become a bit more familiar though, that tends to be when the public perceptions are allowed to morph. Maybe not wholly to acceptance, but at the very least to a place where both sides can start having fun with the concept. And boy, do we have a lot to say about that.
You know, you could sit on my lap if you wanted to. Yeah, I could pet you like a Bond villain. No? Okay.
So, as we've seen, queer characters depicted as villains have been around long before cinema made its debut, but thanks to Hollywood and film, screen then became the easiest and most accessible form of visual communication that allowed people to formulate opinions of people, places, and situations that they had never personally encountered. And sadly, preconceived biases and ideas surrounding all of these things didn't exactly make it easy to dispel people's attitudes towards them. And this held especially true for queer people. Granted, it wasn't immediate death or devilry in the very beginning. Queer-coded characters were still very present alongside the emergence of cinema, and even were allowed to simply exist in the sidelines quietly for a while, such as in the form of the, quote, sissy archetype. Nowadays, this obviously isn't a favourable depiction, nor was the terminology, but at least they were alive, I guess. That is, at least, until the 1930s, and if we're going to talk about queer characters in this era, then we also have to talk about the Hays Code, and its lasting impact on visual media. I've spoken about the Hays Code previously on this channel some time ago, but just as a refresher, the Hays Code was a standardised set of guidelines created by Hollywood to keep in line with the emerging regulations brought in by the American government. It forbade the use of profanity, obscenity, racial slurs, and included detailed instructions outlining how certain topics should be shown on screen, particularly in regards to graphic violence, criminality, substance use, promiscuity, interracial relationships, and of course, homosexuality. It ran from 1934 to 68, but in its final years, people were more or less just phasing out a lot of the guidelines, and it was replaced... Hello, okay, I'll let you out. But in its final years, people were more or less just phasing out a lot of the guidelines, and it was replaced in 1968 by the motion picture rating system that we still use today. Thanks to this code, narratives that were inclusive of queer characters, or at least as much as what directors could get away with at the time, were now inextricably tied to one of two paths: irredeemable villainy or certain death. Oftentimes both. Gay characters could not be explicitly named as such, be they gay, lesbian, bisexual, or otherwise, and any advances towards the opposite sex could not be overtly so, though some crafty crews did manage to get past this on occasion, one such example being the 1963 film The Haunting, where it was permitted for there to be some romantic inclinations between the two female lead characters so long as there was no direct physical contact. This led to some very clever camera and lighting work being used to achieve the film's end result. One such prominent example of queer villains in this era are that of Bruno Antony, in Alfred Hitchcock's 1952 film Strangers on a Train. The story revolves around two men who meet on a train, one of whom is a psychopath who suggests that they exchange murders so that neither will get caught. Bruno suggests he kill the protagonist Guy Haynes' wife, Miriam, in exchange for Guy to kill Bruno's father. This exchange would make it so that neither man would be suspected, as they have no other connection or motive besides the train ride, which no one would ever know of. Roger Ebert, a notable film critic of the time, stated that it is this sense of two flawed characters, one evil, one weak, with an unstated sexual tension that makes the movie intriguing and halfway plausible, and explains how Bruno could come so close to carrying out his plan. Even though the queer-coded villain trope was clearly used out of less than respectable attitudes, there was at least still a detection of humanity within the characters that were ascribed with this label, and that, at the very least, I can be grateful for when it comes to many films during this era. The Hays Code, while some can argue as to why it got brought in, many say that it was in response to Hollywood becoming too influential and available to the public without any form of regulation, much like the early days of the internet with kids getting exposed to God knows what, but it was still very much seen as a restrictive drag on creative expression that prevented a multitude of stories to be told in their intended manner and only catered to specific idealized narratives, mainly white heteronormative heroes championing adversary, i.e. anyone or thing that wasn't white or heteronormative. There is in fact a difference between regulation and censorship, and the Hays Code just took things a little bit too far over the line in that respect. Even despite these obvious limitations making outright assertions difficult though, creativity is often strongest in the face of adversary, and the intrigue brought on by the audience, no doubt from the combined mystique, boldness, and flair that many of these queer characters often exhibited, ensured that even in these restrictive circumstances, we ended up with some of the most memorable villains in all of cinema, sometimes even being more popular as the decades wore on than the heroes of their respective stories. And these characters only became more bold and outlandish after the Hays Code was abandoned, especially so in kids' media where exaggerated, attention-grabbing personalities reigned supreme. And there's no bigger culprit for this than a certain family entertainment studio that later ballooned into a billion-dollar company. I'll give you 3 guesses. Disney is infamous for its implementation of queer-coded villains within its films, with a fair few of them coming about from the proclaimed renaissance of the late 80s to the turn of the century. Off the top of my head, I can already think of a few with a couple of very interesting stories behind them. Probably one of the most obvious of the bunch is Ursula from The Little Mermaid, whose appearance was heavily inspired by the drag queen Divine. In fact, upon release of the film, Ursula was immediately embraced as one of Disney's best villains, and continues to be ranked highly among the studio's greatest by the media because she's fantastic. I don't know what to tell you, she's outrageous, she's vulgar, she's just fun to watch. And believe it or not, they were actually planning to go even further with her design by deriving even more inspiration from one of Divine's films, Pink Flamingos, which is a choice, where the main character Babs Johnson sported a mohawk and tattoos. The animators did eventually decide that that might be too over the top for the film, but what they did decide to keep left us with the campy, beguiling sea witch we know today. Then of course we have the likes of Scar from The Lion King, who just oozes a sense of queer confidence attributed to his body language and diction. What also contributed to a lot of Scar's decidedly queer leanings was likely due to his animator, Andreas Deja, being an openly gay man who had direct influence over how his character's visual behaviours and cues were conducted. In fact, this might be pretty obvious now, but back then it was still kind of an open secret that a lot of queer people went to work in animation and went on to be the individuals responsible for so many queer-coded characters we see in films. An especially notable contributor was Howard Elliott Ashman, who worked on the music for both The Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast. Ashman sadly died of AIDS in 1991, shortly after Beauty and the Beast's debut in theatres, and was credited with giving a mermaid her voice and a beast his soul. Moving on though, speaking of Beauty and the Beast, another very intriguing example that many have previously discussed but still manages to surprise people is actually Gaston. Gaston very clearly wants to marry Belle, there's no contention with that, but the way in which he is drawn and made to behave actually invokes a very heavy inclination towards the male gaze. Furthermore, he pursues Belle for the sake of his own self-interest, which is a trait that is often seen as negative when we look at how queer people are lauded in real life for doing the same. Choosing to lead an unconventional lifestyle that suits your own interests as opposed to the people around you is considered an extremely selfish thing to do, apparently, even when these self-interested motivations are completely harmless. And what's even more intriguing about this is that we still have a character in the film who puts other people first and is still saddled with the queer label. I'm of course talking about LeFou. Where Gaston might be strong, confident, and a pinnacle of male objectification, LeFou is the opposite. He's weak, snivelly, and bends to Gaston's every whim, which to the audience also emasculates him by comparison. It's a really weird dynamic, and they feel almost like two sides of the same coin. Gaston is the textbook depiction of what straight people think gay men find attractive, whereas LeFou is a depiction of how straight people think queer people behave. At least that's the vibe I kind of get. Admittedly though, even though these characters are still very much viewed as reductive stereotypes of queer deviancy, for the people creating them, they were likely a symbol of defiance. Characters who were unapologetically themselves even if the world hated them, which is a very wide sentiment even today that isn't strictly confined to the Alphabet Club. I can honestly go on about this for hours. I haven't even touched on Timon and Pumbaa, who raised a child together and managed to swerve public favour towards queer-coded comic relief characters as opposed to just the villains. Lumiere and Cogsworth also very much interact with each other like an old married couple. Combine that with Lumiere being so heavily interpreted as bisexual and just, yeah. Oh, Disney, you fell so far. But of course, the trope of the queer villain doesn't stop there. In fact, there may very well still be a long way to go.
And now she's asleep. Cool. Alright.
I can't say for certain when exactly depictions and perceptions began to take a turn, as these kinds of things tend to be more gradual than one might expect, and a singular film or show is seldom the only thing to be the driving force of change. Many films, TV shows, and other media properties may take a majority of the credit, but progress is a group effort, and it's important to understand that even the most notorious media properties that are accredited with changing the tides of public perception have their own influences and inspirations. For example, there are a fair few queer couples in fantasy where one experiences corruption from an evil force, but is aided by a trusted loved one to keep them tethered, and this trope is often attributed to the influence of Frodo and Sam from the Lord of the Rings trilogy in the early 2000s. And it was likely the original author of the books, Jolkin Rolkin Tolkien, never actually intended for them to be anything other than friends, considering Sam has a love interest in Rosie back at the Shire, but it was enough to spur a movement of this kind of dynamic. Anyone who knows me as a friend will probably also know that I'm a huge fan of John and Martin from the Magnus Archives, where the two are explicitly a couple towards the end, and the final season exhibits this exact trope to a T. Again, you may ask, Apollo, what does this have to do with queer villains? Well, because somewhere around the mid-2000s there was a shift in regards to how villain characters in general were received and interpreted by fans. This was in part due to how much more mainstream fandom culture was becoming, and also due to an especially popular animated TV show that set a precedent for sympathetic, angsty villains with redemption arcs. So let's talk about Prince Zuko from Avatar. This guy, from what I can attest, while he likely may not have been the first example, is definitely the most famous within fandom circles. He's obviously not queer, but his character arc going from a disgraced, angry, vengeful son of a dictator to a trusted, worldly travelled and humbled friend to the person he once hunted has both fandom and mainstream entertainment by the throat, and he seems to have been the catalyst for the current trend surrounding sympathetic villain characters. In fact, a popular term that's been coined for this is getting a Zuko arc. This new dynamic also coincides with former biases of queer villains, which in turn causes people to reconcile with modern endearments towards them. And these endearments became even more commonplace thanks to a variety of TV shows, and the ones that likely had the most notoriety and influence for queer rep during the 2010s were the Cartoon Network shows Adventure Time and Steven Universe. Adventure Time had much of the same hallmarks of not quite ascribing a name to several relationships, mostly because it was one of the first to be a lot more bold in their approach, but it also made them easy enough to pick up on that they became popular mainstays throughout the series, and even more so in later iterations of the franchise. Someone who has never watched the original Adventure Time could probably piece together that Princess Bubblegum and Marceline had something going on, for instance. And another huge contributor, which is pretty undeniable for several reasons, is of course Steven Universe. Rebecca Sugar, having worked on both shows, worked tirelessly to try and overhaul the common tropes of queer rep in children's media, and in an interview in The Evolution of Queer Characters in Kids Animated TV Shows by Chris Snyder, Sugar went on record to state, "If you can only exist as a villain or joke, I mean, that's a really heavy thing to be saturated with as a kid." And, you know, she's not wrong. That said, villains aren't going away, but the current trend of granting them more personality, characterization, and grace lends itself to the queer villain trope having less of a negative connotation in wider society, as being queer is becoming less and less of a boogeyman. A fantastic example of this is Catra from She-Ra. Anyone who saw the original She-Ra cartoon from 1985 will be able to tell you that it was a show. The characters were there. It mostly existed to sell toys, let's be honest, and a lot of the characters were very one-dimensional and pretty arbitrary because of this. So when we got a reboot of the show with She-Ra and the Princess of Power, where merchandising was no longer a concern, and the crew could actually develop these characters to have more depth, Catra was an immediate fan favourite. Not only did she have a compelling reason to both be at odds with and gravitate towards Adora during their shared experience of growing up in the Horde, Adora's apparent betrayal and Catra's coming to grips with the reality of their circumstances automatically draws people in, even outside of the increasingly obvious romantic tension between them, only for that tension to reach a climax in the finale with the two sharing a kiss. This honestly was monumental for many people, and a hopeful sign of good things to come. Being queer is no longer being viewed as an indicator of a broken conscience, and instead something that can just be what it is, a facet of anyone's personality, something they should not be ashamed of, regardless of who they're attracted to. And miraculously, we're also at a point where queer rep doesn't even have to pertain to just romantic relationships. I feel like I can't speak on this without also mentioning a particular character that's captured many people's attention recently. We're going to jump out of Western animation for a moment and dive into how these depictions are being presented in other parts of the world, namely Japan, in the form of Himiko Toga from My Hero Academia. When we look at how queer characters are presented in anime, it's actually pretty interesting because, surprise, not everywhere in the world shares the same sentiments around certain things. And it's not always for better or for worse, it's just different. From what I've seen, and this is mostly down to what I've watched in the 2000s because I've mostly given up on anime, while some of the more highly regarded shonen anime, for example, like One Piece, will have significant instances of queer rep, a lot of shonen anime, and even manga in particular, will still hold the philosophy of queerness being an open secret, a kind of wink and nudge situation, if you will. Toga feels pretty indicative of that, which is why I found the conclusion of her character so interesting when you compare her to other implied queer characters in Western media. And it's especially interesting given that she's a villain. In her last moments in the series, she's given an affirmation from Ochako that she could have had the acceptance and love she so craved, and this was given to her. Toga in turn also provided Ochako with the strength to keep going in kind. It's incredibly subtle, which is why I felt she was worth a mention, because just relegating her to Western standards of the bury or gaze treatment didn't exactly feel appropriate. It feels almost like a meta-commentary of how if people weren't so afraid of people being different and just used the appropriate language and syntax, a lot of heartache and misunderstanding can be avoided. But alas. Finally, this is also emphasised back in Western media as well, such as in the case of the breakout film of 2023, Nimona. This one just feels especially ironic when you consider all the history behind its production. Despite being 70% complete, Nimona's studio, Bluesky, was acquired by Disney and subsequently shut down, devastating so many people who had been waiting for N.D. Stevenson's story to be adapted to screen, and further antagonising Disney for their flimsy and half-hearted contempt for anything in the realm of queer progressivism, which is just frustrating when they continuously harp on about having the first Disney queer character and then make the most half-baked attempt at said representation or whatever, because it just makes them look like giant cowards. I hate Disney. All my homies hate Disney. Anyway, Nimona is amazing, and it's amazing because a lot of media that revolves around queer characters usually pertains to these characters being untoward adults. Nimona is just a kid who is oftentimes visibly different from others, and she is shunned for it, leading her to ultimately choosing to take on the antagonistic role that so many place onto her, despite only wanting one thing: friendship, connection. And when she finds that in Ballister, she finds a sense of kinship and community with whom she can rally with and just be herself around. It's an incredibly nuanced and sensitive take on how queer kids can often feel isolated and made to feel that maybe they should just give in and be the villains that everyone tells them that they are, only to happen upon someone else who understands their struggles and is willing to stick with them. It's a very powerful message, and it's a message of hope, I think. And I'm really hoping that we do get more of these kinds of characters in the future. It's uncertain which direction things may take in the future as far as representation within our media is concerned, but one thing's for certain: things never stay the same, and things never stay bad for long. But anyway, there we have it. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. Again, please remember to like and subscribe if you want to hear from me again, and consider commenting if anything I mentioned resonated with you. Do you have a favourite example of this trope? What do you think of it? How do you think it's going to develop in the future? Please let me know. Thank you as always to my absolutely lovely patrons. Thank you to my YouTube peeps, Jesse Sparks, Manuel Legzon Gonzalez, Ash Valentine, Lauren R, Mystic Mind, Pedanticat, and Ed Boy. And an extra special thank you to my indie production supporters, Morgan LaFay DeThin, Matty A, Kiyoshi, and Roundcat. If you'd like to become a patron, a link to my page will be down below. Stay safe, everyone. and I will speak to you in the next one. Bye! With one of the most famously and controversially revised aspects. Yes, sweetheart. What's going on? Leaving Achilles to finally abandon his restraint and... Hello! Oh, that little whine.